I would like to start today's talk with what we all know to be a truism about opera. Producing opera is always a difficult, challenging, expensive, and fraught undertaking. You know this to be true. You get the Opera Baltimore fundraising request emails on a regular basis. We know that doing this is an expensive and difficult undertaking. This is nothing new in the history of opera. And I start with this point because the opera you will see today, Benjamin Britten's Albert Herring, is a real demonstration of triumphing against those challenges, triumph over those challenges. And so to tell the story of how we get to Benjamin Britten's Albert Herring and what he is accomplishing in this work, we need to back up just a couple of years to June of 1945. In June of 1945, Benjamin Britten's opera Peter Grimes had its successful premiere. This opera was a huge deal in the operatic world of England and the United Kingdom. Because you see, the history of English opera across the 19th century and up to Benjamin Britten's time was largely a history of not English opera, but rather operas arriving in England. There are, to be honest, 0 operas from the 19th and early 20th century that have made it into the international repertory before Benjamin Britten finally succeeded with a work that was so powerful and so successful in Peter Grimes that he almost single-handedly puts the idea of English composers writing opera back on the map of the international repertory. This should have been a triumphant moment for Benjamin Britten. He did, after all, write this opera that was welcomed by the public, beloved by the critics, but perhaps a challenge to produce, perhaps not particularly welcome by English opera companies that, after all, had spent the last century and a half or more of time dealing with how do we produce foreign operas and not dealing with how do we create brand new works. In fact, even amongst the original cast, the idea that you might say make a recording of a brand new English composed opera seemed to puzzle them, because although Benjamin Britten in 1945 wanted to make a recording of Peter Grimes, the cast decided to drop out of the recording project. They couldn't recognize the value in doing that. So, although, yes, the opera was a critical and popular success, it was enough to convince Britten that trying to do it again was maybe not the best plan. For you see, Peter Grimes is a very large opera. It requires a big chorus, it has many roles, needs a very large orchestra, requires lots of different set changes, all the things that make opera grand, or also read in parentheses, expensive. And so in 1946, June of 1946, we read Benjamin Britten articulating his new stance for what he would like to try instead, something that maybe will have a smoother pathway towards success, that won't require all of the anxiety that came with Peter Grimes. So here's Britten in the 30th of June, 1946, writing a letter to his publisher, Ralph Hawkes of Boosey and Hawkes. He writes, quote, "I am keen to develop a new art form, the chamber opera, which will stand beside the grand opera as the quartet stands beside the orchestra. I hope to write many works for it." So it is a distinction of size. His initial thought is, well, given that Peter Grimes was so big, maybe a smoother approach would be to go small. If it requires fewer resources, then there are more places that it can be performed. It will require less cost to produce. Involved at this same time is a man named Eric Crozier. Crozier will eventually go on to become the librettist of Albert Herring, the opera that you are seeing this afternoon. He was involved with Britten's operatic undertakings from the beginnings of Peter Grimes because he was the producer and director of that show. So recalling this period in which Benjamin Britten is trying to chart an alternative path forward with the genre of opera, Eric Crozier writes this: "We knew that after Grimes, we had to go on. We had to create and stage more English operas. The idea, what should they do? He writes, quote, "We should form a small company of gifted singers, with ourselves as artistic directors, no chorus, and the smallest group of instrumentalists that Ben would find acceptable for chamber opera." So they've got a plan. But they don't yet have a way to enact this plan because Britten has only talked about creating chamber opera. He needs to actually write what I guess in today's parlance we might consider a proof of concept, a demonstration that chamber opera can actually work. Now, there are some important precedents that Benjamin Britten could draw inspiration from. Precedents in English operatic history. But we have to go all the way back to the Baroque era to find these important precedents. The first one, 1689, the year in which Henry Purcell writes his opera Dido and Aeneas, an opera for a relatively small cast that can be performed with a very small orchestra. It was, in fact, true chamber opera before the term even exists. You may be aware that Dido and Aeneas was originally written for an all-girls school and performed in probably a room no larger than the one we are seated in right now for just the private audience of the fellow schoolmates. There is another important precedent. English opera, as I said, across the 19th century and the 20th century, was the story of foreign operas coming to England. But if we go back into the 18th century, there were important composers writing important operas in England, most prominently, of course, George Friedrich Handel, who is writing not English language operas, but rather Handel is writing Italian language opera seria, cast largely with Italian-trained singers. Handel was very popular doing this for a number of decades in the early 1700s, but eventually the English opera audience's tastes changed. They decided they were tired of going to the theater and seeing foreign composers write operas for foreign singers in foreign languages, and they wanted something in English. Handel, always a good businessman, recognizes that he needs to shift his focus to writing English language oratorio instead. So surely you're familiar with works like Handel's Messiah, but there are many, many oratorios that he, again, shifts to meet the audience taste. There is another work from this same context, though, that is, again, a very important precedent for what Britten is trying to do. We might even say what Britten is trying to resurrect in his creation of the chamber opera. In 1728, an opera was written entitled The Beggar's Opera. You might be more familiar with this material through the Bertolt Brecht Kurt Weill Threepenny Opera, which uses the same story, the same plot matter. The Beggar's Opera was conceived to be a reaction against those foreign language Italian opera seria that Handel had been writing, because the Beggar's Opera is an opera for a cast of singing actors rather than opera singers, and its musical material is all derived from folk songs and popular melodies rather than the newly composed elaborate coloratura that Handel was writing on the stage. So we have here examples of small-scale works and examples of works that are trying to specifically target the tastes of an English opera audience. It is notable that eventually, once Benjamin Britten founds the company to produce his chamber operas, a company that will be called the English Opera Group, Britten makes his own modernized adaptations of both Purcell's Dido and Aeneas and Pepusch's The Beggar's Opera for this company to perform. So this is intimately bound up with his project. But I divert, though, from his proof of concept demonstration. To prove that chamber opera can work, in July of 1946, Benjamin Britten stages a work called The Rape of Lucretia. This is a serious and tragic plot, as its title suggests. The plot is set in ancient Rome, in pre-Christian pagan ancient Rome, where the title character of Lucretia is presented as the most virtuous woman in Rome, whose virtue is taken, hence the title, and because she has lost her virtue, she ultimately takes her own life. That's what happens in the rape of Lucretia. This is obviously a very serious and very tragic story, and despite it being set in pagan Roman times, there are two additional characters that are called the male chorus and the female chorus. Chorus in the sense not of a choir singing together, but in the sense of the ancient Greek tragedy, where a chorus comments upon the action. Britten uses his two chorus characters to comment upon this pre-Christian plot, but to sort of cast it in the context of a Christian moralistic viewpoint. The premiere of this opera occurs at Glyndebourne, the Glyndebourne Festival, still a very important festival of opera in England. The opera was successful with the public. We have heard this pattern before, right? Successful with many of the critics, but put on with much resistance from the management of Glyndebourne, who, quite frankly, would have been more happy to have staged another Mozart opera or another Verdi opera or another Puccini opera, and were not particularly interested in the style of modern mid-20th century music that Benjamin Britten was composing. So, the concept works. The opera, in fact, is successful with the public, successful with the critics, also tours around England, where it is performed at smaller venues in front of smaller local audiences who again find the chance to see opera by a local composer in their own native language to be a very impactful evening in the theater. So you'd think this would mean everything is working, except for the fact that, again, Glyndebourne is not particularly thrilled to be taking on this challenge. So, what do they need to do? Well, if we can't put on our operas with the company's approval, then we need to found our own company. And thus comes into existence the group that they had been planning for at least a year, the so-called English Opera Group. Here I'll quote from their prospectus. The prospectus says this: "We believe the time has come when England can create its own operas. We believe the best way to achieve the beginnings of a repertory of English operas is through the creation of a form of opera requiring small resources. A first essay in this direction was Britten's The Rape of Lucretia. The success of this experiment has encouraged the persons chiefly involved to continue their work as a group by establishing," and then in all caps, "the English Opera Group. This group will give annual seasons of contemporary opera in English and suitable classical works, including those of Purcell." So now they formed a company. Now they need to build a repertory. And having written, as proof of concept, The Rape of Lucretia, Britten is in search of a follow-up chamber opera. And he wants something that will be radically different than that one, a strong dramatic contrast from this very serious and tragic plot. Eric Crozier, who has been around, is thinking about what should we do, and he comes up with an idea for a plot suggestion that comes from a short story written by the French author Guy de Maupassant. If you watched my Zoom talks, I spent a lot of time looking at this text, and so I would encourage you, if you're interested to learn more, check out those recordings where they stream online. But in a nutshell, Guy de Maupassant's short story has as its narrative frame a sort of satire on the habits of small-town country life, because the narrator of the story is a cosmopolitan, well-educated, well-to-do Frenchman from Paris who finds himself, because his train breaks down, in some little teeny town in the countryside where he remembers one of his old classmates is now settled. And so he goes to find his old classmate and is quite critical of all of the sort of country backwoods habits that this formerly cosmopolitan gentleman has allowed himself to relax into. And in the course of their conversation, just sort of as a passing anecdote, this local small-town country doctor tells his friend from the big city, Paris, the story of how back in the day in this town, there used to be a rich aristocratic woman who decided that to endorse and support good morality in the upbringing of the local children, she would offer a prize, a cash prize in the springtime, to be awarded to the most virtuous girl in town. There are none to be found, so they decide to instead award it to the most virtuous boy in town. And the anecdote continues from there. Ultimately, Guy de Maupassant is wishing to use it as a cautionary tale against not falling into alcoholism. It is hard to believe that Crozier could have recognized the potential for an opera in that little anecdote in passing from Guy de Maupassant. But quite ingeniously, what Crozier and Britten come up with is the potential to rework this kernel of a plot idea into a social comedy. And the opera you will see this afternoon is a truly funny 20th century opera. There are not particularly many truly funny comic operas from the 20th century, but this is one of them. One of the reasons why they were so successful at this, of course, is the quality of the text that Crozier wrote. And that was another issue that I dealt with at great length in one of my earlier talks. What I want to focus on today, though, is the way in which Britten and Crozier quite ingeniously crafted an opera that could be so relatable to their audience, an opera that still is strikingly relatable to us today. For Britten and Crozier, the key to unlocking this challenge was to set the opera in the place where they were from. The plot is relocated from the rural French countryside to eastern Suffolk County. This is a county on the east coast of England, the county where Benjamin Britten himself grew up. It is the kind of village scene that would have existed in the not too distant memory of all of Britten's early audience. Britten is writing this opera in 1946. It gets premiered in 1947, but it is set in the year 1900. So that is to say, the people that populate the story on stage are essentially the generation of the grandparents of those who are watching the opera. So this is an opera that is meant to be populated by character types that we all recognize. Thus, we find the richest woman in town who thinks she knows best and can dictate to others what they should do. We find the busybody mayor who thinks he knows best and can tell others what to do. We find the holier-than-thou vicar who thinks he knows best and can tell each other what to do. We find the schoolmistress tasked with raising the brats of the village, who of course thinks she knows best and can tell them what to do. You get the point here. These are stereotypical, archetypal characters of a sort that certainly Benjamin Britten's opera audience would have recognized as people that they knew and grew up with, just as I think it is not a big stretch for us today to observe those foibles in the people that we know ourselves. So it is set in a place that is familiar to the audience, populated with people that is familiar to the audience. And indeed, many of the names of the characters have real-world antecedents. I'll just mention one in particular. The character of Nancy in the opera bears the name of the singer who created this role, Nancy Evans. And at the time that Britten and Crozier were at work on this opera, Nancy Evans and the librettist Eric Crozier were falling in love with each other. Thus, it is no stretch to see the characters in the opera, Nancy and Sid, as mirrors of the real-world Nancy and the real-world librettist Eric Crozier. Benjamin Britten in this opera writes wonderfully emotive, romantically tinged music for these two characters. And there is no question but that he is seeing sort of the flowering relationship between these two real-world people and putting that relationship on the stage. And so indeed, many of the names of places, of people, all come from real-world antecedents, with the key exception of the town itself. Loxford is an imaginary place, but the kind of town that probably most of Britain's opera audience, if they did not grow up in a place like that, at least had been to and seen many times. Another interesting real-world connection, our title character of Albert Herring. He runs the grocery shop. It's apparently his family's business. His father is deceased. His mother runs it, and he's the one who works the shop. Well, both Benjamin Britten and Eric Crozier had, when they were teenagers, found employment in small-town shops just like this. So they are writing about their own experience, too. let me point out a couple of specific aspects of the plot that need just a bit of translation. So we'll find that the action of this opera is set on May Day. So May 1st, we've missed it by just a little bit here on the Sunday show. The opera ends on May 2nd, so that was when the Friday show happened. And the opera passes over April 30th when the first show happens. But May Day or May the 1st is where this opera is set, where instead of, again, this French habit of the so-called rosier, giving the cash prize to whoever the rosier is, they instead use the term May King for seeking out who will be the most virtuous person in the town. They are really looking for a May Queen, but again, none of the girls are virtuous enough, so they shall find a May King instead. The prize for being the May King is a purse of 25 pounds sovereign. Now, we need to unpack just how significant of a prize this is, because we'll see when it is announced that Albert is not particularly thrilled to have been honored in this way, but his mother sure pushes him to not have any choice but to accept this reward. And we can see why. A sovereign is a gold coin. And so we can do some basic calculations of the value of gold contained in 25 sovereigns. Today, that's worth $19,000. And inflation does not do it full justice because, of course, what are the annual wages of a small-town shopkeeper in England circa 1900? I mean, this is like more money than Albert Herring would see in a whole year. So obviously, this is a major, major prize. Another distinctive aspect of the opera that Crozier and Britten come up with. This is a true ensemble cast opera. There is no standout lead character. Yes, of course, we have the title role of Albert Herring, but there is plenty of there is plenty of time when he does not particularly have much to do on stage. There's no true prima donna role, although the character of Lady Billows, the aristocratic wealthiest woman in town, certainly sings the most ostentatious music. But really what is characteristic of this opera is the way that the characters are so much in conversation with each other. This is an opera that plays very conversationally. It plays almost like a play. Indeed, the libretto that Eric Crozier wrote is quite substantive, by which I mean it is long. There is a lot of text in this opera. It is a very wordy opera. 13 characters in total. The sort of upper-class characters of the townsfolk, Lady Billows, the vicar, the police superintendent, the mayor, the schoolmistress. Then there's the working-class characters, like Albert Herring's mother. There are the young adults of the town, Albert Herring, his friends Sid and Nancy. And then there's the next generation coming up, the 3 school children. And that brings us to 13. Balancing the 13 characters in Benjamin Britten's original conception of the work is a scoring for a very small miniaturized orchestra. Remember, the whole point of chamber opera is to make it easily producible so that they can get around opera producers who are not thrilled to put their money and efforts into new works. So to balance the 13 characters, we find an orchestra that consists of flute, oboe, clarinet, bassoon, French horn, percussion, many different instruments, but one player, also harp and piano, 2 violins, viola, cello, and bass. 13 cast members, 13 instruments in the orchestra. Now, in our performance, of course, we'll hear it accompanied just with piano, but I would strongly encourage you, if you've never had the chance to listen to Albert Herring in its original form, after you see the show today, it is worth going back and listening to a recording with that ensemble, because Britten is ingenious at coming up with a wealth of timbral approaches, a dramatic impetus that belies the fact that it's just 13 instruments. It's a really remarkable conception. As you listen to this work, you will observe that Britten is, at its core, using an old-fashioned approach to constructing opera. Much of the conversation-like, dialogue-like scenes are set as recitative, so sort of going back to the old Baroque-era opera seria model. Recitative accompanied just by simple chords from the piano, versus other moments that are more song-like, aria-like moments, and all of the characters will have their turns. Britten's musical language is strongly referential. You will hear examples that reference bel canto-style scena form. You will hear examples that reference Wagner quotations. You will hear examples that reference English popular song, parlor ballads, hymnody. It is an idiom that also draws inspiration from Purcell and Handel. Benjamin Britten is trying to show sort of his whole awareness of the operatic history that has preceded him, and particularly the English musical history that has preceded him. I say this not because you will necessarily pick up on those moments when they happen. You will hopefully be too involved in the plot and the drama to be doing that level of musical analysis. But I mention it to understand, though, just the high level of intellectual sophistication that Britten has packed this effervescent, entertaining score with. So, enough about the work itself. Let's go back to the history of it, and we'll see how this one plays out. This is Britten's third opera for the English stage. The work was undertaken in the fall of 1946, continuing through the spring of 1947. This included a significant stretch of time when Britten, along with his partner Peter Pears, were in Switzerland on a skiing holiday. The way it worked was they would get up in the morning, Britten would compose, they would go out skiing in the afternoon, and then come back and work some more on the opera in the evening. Eric Crozier at one point was summoned to join them in Switzerland so that he could keep working on the libretto while Britten was composing. So the work is wrapped up. It is ready to go into production. The premiere occurs on the 20th of June, 1947, performed by his newly formed English opera group, but again, staged at the Glyndebourne Festival, whom you remember was already problematic to Britten once when they did his Rape of Lucretia a year ago. Again, the usual patterns play out. Audience approval, critic approval, the management goes around saying things like, well, this isn't really our kind of work, being very belittling to what Britten has done, making it clear that they are not in favor of supporting newly composed modern opera. The work was successful enough, though, that they decided to take the English opera group on tour. They performed both Albert Herring and the Rape of Lucretia as a pair of contrasting works. It's sort of like the tragedy and the satyr play in ancient Greek drama is the idea of the pairing here. Here is how Eric Crozier described what happened, though, when they went on tour. Crozier writes, quote, "The artists were traveling by train. Our scenery was on its way in 3 enormous lorries, or trucks. We were proud of the warm and appreciative response our new operas could draw from European audiences. And yet, there was something absurd about traveling so far to win success with British operas that Manchester, Edinburgh, and London would not support." That is, the 3 cities with the biggest and most important opera companies in England, who seemed not interested in these hugely successful new contemporary English operas. Crozier continues, "The cost of transporting 40 people and their scenery was enormously high. Despite packed houses in Holland, despite financial support from the British Council in Switzerland, it looked as if we should lose at least £3,000 on 12 continental performances. It was exciting to represent British music at international festivals, but we could not hope to repeat the experiment another year. Why travel to festivals if they're only going to lose money? Well, we've seen the pattern before. If opera companies won't produce new works, found your own opera company. If you lose money going to festivals, found your own festival. And thus leads to the decision to stick to Britten's roots and found a festival of music near his hometown, and thus begins the first Aldborough Festival in 1948, which notably included performances of Albert Herring. So this is sort of the hometown opera come home, because Aldborough is in East Suffolk. Here's an interesting quote. When Albert Herring was performed in 1948, the theater that they were using for this was so small that there was no space for refreshments for you to get at intermission. So people had to go across the street to the nearest pub. And an intrepid reporter tracks down a localman, somebody who had probably never been to an opera before in his life, and catches him at the pub at intermission and says, "So how you liking the show?" And this is the guy's report. He says, "I took a ticket for this show because it is local, and I felt I had to. I'd have sold it to anyone for sixpence earlier on. I wouldn't part with it now for £10. So it seems like Britten's efforts to create the opera based upon his people and his place and put that on the stage for his people at his place paid off. In 1964, after the Alborough Festival had been going for many years, Britten receives an award in acknowledgement of his service to music of the area. And he gives a speech at which he says this: "I belong at home in Alborough. I have tried to bring music to it in the shape of our local festival, and all the music I write comes from it. I believe in roots, in associations, in backgrounds, in personal relationships." And indeed, that is the key to, I think, what makes Albert Herring just such a compelling work of theater. It is built on the personal relationships of those who inhabit this small town. And now, of course, you, as the audience for this afternoon's show, are a part of those personal relationships too. I hope you enjoy. Thank you very much.